Hey there, this is Becca. So as teachers, you all know the principle of repetition. Repeat something a bajillion times in the hopes that students are more likely to remember it. But there's also ways you can design your resources to make it easier for students to direct their attention and then figure out what they're supposed to remember. So let's take a look. So the question we're really asking today is how typography can be a tool to help direct students' attention, help them figure out what's important, and move forward in the material. I'm going to look at 3 different ways that you can do this. And the first is with text hierarchy. We're going to start by looking at this post by Daniil Bersan. So this is startlingly accurate. You read the largest text first, and then the second largest, which is smaller but bolded right underneath, and then your eyes travel down, and then finally, you make your way to the top. This is called text hierarchy, and it's all about establishing relationships between ideas, between text, and also what you think is most important. And the helpful and kind of amazing part of this is that it's true for everyone. It's a really simple principle of universal design that you can apply in order to help students figure out, okay, this is the most important information that I need to remember, and then this is how all the other parts respond to it. This happens all the time. You're already doing this. There's ways to do it intentionally, so you're really forcing your students to say, okay, this is the most important thing that you might be repeating 100 times, but then they're also seeing it in a graphic way. And one really easy way to do this is by changing text size, which we'll talk about in a second. But you can also change the font itself. And we have another video that goes through how you can use font to help establish a tone in your classroom. So take a look if you're interested in that as well. So now we're going to look at the second way to help direct student attention. So the first is text hierarchy, which is just being super conscious of where you're putting your information. The second is font size. And these are related to each other, but they don't necessarily have to be. There's no hard and fast rule for how large your font should be in order to help your students learn. This depends on so many different factors, from what type of font you use to where your students are at in their learning journey. So the first is just to be consistent. So let's say that you have a daily PowerPoint you have for your kiddos. You choose 30 points for the header, maybe 18 points for the subheader, 12 points for the text. It doesn't really matter the size. But then in a few slides, you can't fit everything in. You want to establish that relationship through hierarchy because you know that the concepts are related, so you make some text a little bit smaller and some text a little bit larger, and soon it is a flying bonanza of font sizes. And it's confusing because our brains are constantly searching for patterns. And if students are busy figuring out why some of this text is bigger and some of it is smaller and some of it's squeezed in onto that slide, and sometimes they're having to kind of squint and push away, it's just confusing and it's taking up brain energy that could go to different places. So a really easy, hard and fast rule is just to be consistent, but then stick to it. And I think that that is a really hard thing to do. It seems very easy, but that consistency is so key to helping direct students' attention and maintain their focus on what actually matters. I know I said that it doesn't actually matter how large or small you go for a type, but that's not 100% true. So first off, you just need people to be able to read what is on there. And one rule that I use for myself is to never go less than 12 points for digital resources. And the reason for this is that computers translate text smaller on the screen than on the page, or at least that's how it appears to our eyes. So if you have a printed resource that's in 10-point font, students can read it just fine, but then on the screen, it's super hard for them to read, or it's a little bit harder, which is unnecessary. We don't need to make it harder for students to learn. So in general, I don't go less than 12 points for digital resources, and that's just a rule I made for myself so I don't have to think about it too much. Okay, so we've talked about text hierarchy, what it means to establish that relationship between content graphically on the page, and also font size, which also helps students direct their attention. And the third piece is how you can add emphasis to text in order for students to figure out what is most important. So a lot of times this is something like bolding or italics and underlining. And teachers, you do this all the time. You're constantly bolding things or putting stuff in italics to help draw a student's attention. The challenge is just that too much bolding or inconsistent bolding can actually serve as a distraction. So too much bolding kind of speaks for itself. If everything is emphasized on a page, a student doesn't know what's important. Inconsistent bolding is a little bit harder to spot sometimes. So as we talked about, our brains are constantly making patterns and connections. And if sometimes a teacher is bolding an action, like read, write, consider, and sometimes bolding a location, chapter 10, textbook, the patterns become a little bit muddled. So an easy strategy for figuring out how to bold and how much to bold is simply choose a category of information. Within a set of instructions, I'm going to bold all of the verbs, or I'm going to bold all of the nouns so that students know where to go, something like that. And that kind of takes away your cognitive load of figuring out what to do. So the most common other form of emphasis is italics. And you see, particularly in college and high school, sometimes teachers will italicize a big chunk of text in the instructions, for instance. And this is a bummer because research shows that italics are harder for most people to comprehend, particularly dyslexic brains. So by putting a large chunk of text in italics, you're actually making it harder for students to comprehend that information. So again, there are no rules, but in general, I try to avoid italics or use them really sparingly with only one word or one phrase. It will jump out at students, and it'll jump out even more when it's used sparingly. All right, so that's it. Those are 3 ways that you can use typography to help direct student attention. And again, it's just a lot of being consistent, being creative, and being intentional.